So tonight we'll talk about several different kind of pieces. Textbooks often call these like pillars of the Roman state, things that kept political stability, prevented civil wars from breaking out, and kept the Roman government kind of intact and powerful for many years. Tonight we're mostly just going to talk about the rest of Octavian's lifetime, from the point where he wins the civil wars in the 30s BCE up to year 0, and then 14 years after year 0. So this is a kind of crossing point into the common era today, the years after 0. So we'll talk about several different things Octavian does, building political unity, this idea of the Republic and everybody is equal, destroying the army's ability to question his authority or the Republic's authority and start new civil wars. He and his advisors figure out a way of breaking down the army to make sure it's under control so that it doesn't start new uprisings against the government. How they use entertainment to appeal to the masses of Romans. Basically, these gladiator fights and other kinds of races and entertainments and circuses and all kinds of things to keep the people focused on things that they enjoy in life, sporting events, instead of thinking about the political problems, political corruption, and what kind of real government do you have. So if you distract the people enough, basically, then they will accept this lie that they have a democracy and that the people are really in control through voting. Then the Roman economy and their foreign policies. To start off with political unity, basically Octavian encounters the exact same problem that Caesar did, that we left off with last time. Many leaders of the Roman government didn't really think that this democracy, the so-called republic, that was really just designed to run the city itself, the city of Rome. This republic idea is now 250 years old. It's been around for quite a long time. It is kind of enshrined in the Roman mind to be like the guardian of your freedom. So a lot of Romans believed that their freedom as individuals depended on having this democracy, this republic, this kind of equality. And that if anything happened to the republic, if the democracy goes away, or if someone overthrows it, then all the people will be made slaves to the government. And you get this, statement from writers and reporters and people writing letters and diary entries and all kinds of things that the republic is the safeguard of their liberties, and that the republic disappears and they'll all be slaves. Which is an interesting thing to say, because a lot of them really did own real bonded slaves that they owned and sometimes beat and killed and all kinds of things. But Octavian and a lot of others thought that the republic was designed to run a city, like a city council. But over these past couple hundred years of its existence, the government has conquered this gigantic empire that encircles the whole Mediterranean Sea, from modern-day Spain down through North Africa and all the way across to Egypt and Anatolia and Greece, and then back around the northern part up to Italy again. So how can you have a city council basically run this gigantic empire? Because when you conquer peoples and you control them, a lot of them don't like that, and they look for opportunities to rebel, to get their independence back. So can a democracy through voting and a government designed just to run its own city, can it effectively administer and govern this gigantic empire and all the possible problems that could pop up all over the place, even sometimes at the same time in different places? Or does the Roman government have to be kind of streamlined? Does it need high-level decision makers to react in a crisis and make a decision? Like if there's rebellions in two different places at the same time, where do you send the army? Democratically elected politicians, the thinking on this level goes that they they can't make a fast enough decision. Democracies are slow and sloppy. And what happens today when you have some kind of economic crisis in some part of the United States? What does Congress do? Do they immediately make a decision and go with it? No. They form a subcommittee to study whether or not the problem even exists in the first place. And if they decide that there is a problem, then they'll study the nature of the problem, and they'll bring in experts, and they'll have all this testimony and all these meetings. And these experts might propose a whole list of different proposals, possible solutions for the crisis. And then Congress will debate which one of these proposals they should go with. And then maybe a few months later they might actually get down to a vote and choose one and try to implement it. But when you have an economic crisis or a political uprising or something, if weeks and months go by, that thing could get out of control. Does that make sense? So a lot of political theorists say that with these big governments that govern huge stretches of land, or they govern a lot of people, you need one of these head decision makers, like some kind of high-level authority, so that when a crisis hits, they can make a decision and go with it and try to fix the problem as fast as possible. Does that make sense? So this is kind of bordering on the idea of authoritarianism, to have some kind of executive council or executive body that could make this decision fast. Octavian seemed to be a believer in this idea of centralized authority. So his eventual decision was to create what eventually becomes known as the invisible monarchy, which is basically he is in control of the government and his advisors and his family members. Like, he is the head decision maker, but he can't tell the Roman people that, because they'll get all pissed off and they might start an uprising themselves because they love their democracy. So his trick is to tell them that they have a democracy, that they still have this republican name, they still have elections, the politicians still go out to the forums and have debates. But in reality, Octavian and his inheritors will run the Roman government, like kings, basically. Does that make sense? So it's like a hidden monarchy, or it's a monarchy that refuses to call itself a monarchy. Is that clear? And you get these every once in a while. Even dictators and tyrants today, they still allow very corrupted elections in their countries, and they, just keep running for president over and over again. And what do you know? They're the only person who runs for president. Does that make sense? Because most of the other politicians are so intimidated that they don't even want to make an attempt to run against the tyrant. And you can trace this pretty commonly throughout the world today, and sadly in some places of the world. So how does Octavian kind of get away with this? He doesn't just implement this whole thing right off the bat. He does it in steps over many years. When the civil wars ended in 31 BCE, he and his armies were obviously the big winners of the thing. So he is kind of recognized as the head general of all the armies. And he stays in that position for 4 years. He says to make sure that there's stability, that no other generals or armies or anything try to start a new civil war. But after 4 years, in 27 BCE, he personally goes to the Senate and offers to resign, to retire, basically. And he's only about 30 years old. He's still fairly young. He offers to retire, to give all of his power over the armies back to the Senate, and they could appoint whoever else they want to take over his position. Historians argue that the reason he chose this point only 4 years in is that he knows that the senators are still afraid of future civil wars. So historians argue that he's going to offer to retire, but he knows they won't accept it. Does that make sense? Politically. Because they're scared. They're scared of other dictators trying to rise up and overthrow the Senate. So he formally goes and offers to retire at the Senate, and they all say, no. We don't want you to retire. You don't have to be the head general over all the armies. At this point, they invite him to be governor over some of the provinces, not the city of Rome itself, but the outlying provinces, the parts of the empire, for 10 years. And it's not just one province. They offered to make him governor over 18 provinces at the same time. And how many provinces does Rome have total? 28. Yeah, so, yep, close. But so he's governor over half the Roman Empire all at the same time for 10 years. And when that 10 years is up, he goes back to the Senate and says, okay, it's time for me to retire again. And they say, no, how about another 10-year term as governor over all these provinces? And he'll be governor over all those places for basically the rest of his life. They just keep renewing his term of office every 10 years. Does that make sense? So he is, this would be like if the President of the United States, when they're about to retire, their term of office is up, they go to Congress and say, okay, I did my part, see you later, I'm going home. And Congress invites this person to be governor over 30 states at the same time for 10 years. And then keeps renewing that governorship for the rest of that person's life. Does that make sense? So this is a whole lot of power. It's not, over the Senate. It's kind of administering and running each of these different little places all at the same time. But in doing that, he has control over each of the kind of little provincial economies, and he decides who is mayor in different places and all kinds of things. So it's a hugely powerful position. So he stays governor of these places basically for the rest of his life. And that's the real source is political power, at least one source. Does that make sense? All right. Moving on from here. Octavian is not like a great governor. He's not a great bureaucrat who runs government perfectly. He's not even a great general. I mean, he's far from a great general. He was a general it's an honorable title for him. He really never made decisions about how to fight battles. He had advisors and friends that did that stuff for him. He showed up to the battlefield in all his gear, but he never made the decisions about how the armies should actually fight and how they should win the battles. He had very trusted, lifelong friends that did that stuff for him. Octavian is much more of a master politician. He understands that image is everything, basically, in politics. That you can say and do all kinds of crazy things as long as people believe that you are still a great and honest leader. So Octavian had himself followed around by poets and artists to draw his image to make him look honest and reliable and upstanding, and had himself depicted in these kinds of statues where he's not wearing like a full military uniform. He's wearing kind of the average citizen type of clothes. He doesn't deck himself out in gold and all these kinds of things. He dresses like an average person, or at least an average Roman citizen, which is better than the rest of the average workers. And he always calls himself simply the first of the citizens. He never calls himself king, at least in public. He never allows other people to call him king or emperor or anything like that. Eventually, the Senate gave him this honorary title called Augustus, which kind of translates as majestic and, almost otherworldly kind of. And he appeared to like that a lot. He was very happy with that, but he never called himself that, in public at least, because that gets too close to the idea of king. Whereas he's just trying to represent himself as, I'm just like all of you, the average people out there. It's just that, I come from this wealthy family. I have experience in government, so the Senate calls me to advise them on what to do every once in a while. But he doesn't even have a gigantic bodyguard. He walks through the malls, the forums, amongst the average people and talks to them without fear of them trying to kill him. So he is extremely popular in Rome. He's almost like a guy who can do no wrong. He's like a godly figure to these people. Does that make sense? So he's much better as a politician and a person who understands the usefulness of propaganda in order to convince the average people to support it. Does that make sense? All right. And he'll continue doing this stuff for the rest of his life. He's in power for 45 years or so. So he's in power until the day he dies. He eventually gets sick and dies, as people tend to do when they get older. So, questions about any of this? No? And it's a very useful strategy, and you still see it being used today, even in U.S. politics, right? People running for president or for Congress or something, and their message is often, I'm just like you. I was born into poverty or something. I had to work real hard in school in order or start a business or something that launched my career. Basically, I know what your life is like, so vote for me. Which to me is really interesting when you have politicians running for office who obviously have a very different background, come from like extreme wealth or something and had everything handed to them. Really, they still try to often present themselves as like the average person, and sometimes it's just funny because they don't know what the average people live like. No, there was one guy that ran for president years ago, and some reporters asked him when the last time he had been to a grocery store, and he couldn't even answer it because he has this big mansion and he has his people go buy food for him, and he has cooks. He doesn't have to make his own food. And that was a funny little couple moments where he heard the question and just like deer in the headlights look on his face. He didn't know what to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So and it's still a powerful attempt at kind of getting the people on your side. Augustus and his advisors, he's not running the whole place by himself. He has a whole slew of advisors, just like, say, the President of the United States doesn't know all this stuff about economics and warfare and on and on and on. He appoints high-level advisors, and they study problems themselves, and they come to him or her with advice. So that's usually what presidents and elected leaders and even dictators and tyrants, they don't really usually govern everything themselves, even though some of them might have some expertise in something or other. But these kinds of governments they're too large for any one person to really run all by themselves, at least effectively. They might try it, but they usually screw it up pretty badly. So even Augustus relies on a huge amount of advisors and bureaucrats to study problems and try to come up with solutions. One big thing that they advise and that he implements is to standardize the method of government for all these different places that now makes up the Roman Empire. The 28 different provinces. Basically, each one will get a provincial governor, will get a tax collection system, a road building system, kind of public housing and welfare system, and they will be standardized. The provincial governments will basically all look the same. Even the government buildings will look the same in all these different places. So that if there's a problem in one place, they know exactly who to talk to. Does that make sense? So they didn't standardize every single facet of all these different areas. Outside of the central government for the province, they allowed local mayors and local rituals and ceremonies to still flourish in all these different places, as long as they didn't kind of run into direct contradiction with the Roman government. So they allow a lot of wiggle room for individual cultures to still survive and grow, and as long as they don't try to break away from the Roman state, then the Roman government doesn't really care. Does that make sense? In order to tie their economy and their different provinces together, the Roman government, especially under Augustus, launches off on massive infrastructure projects. The biggest and most famous right down today are the Roman road network. The Roman government builds huge amounts of roads that go all through Gaul and Iberia and through trading lanes in the seas. They build roads that connect all the major cities of North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean coastline, what is today like Israel and Syria and Palestine and all these places, and Anatolia and Greece. It is a massive building system. And the Romans will take their gigantic army, and they don't keep the whole army in Italy. They kind of break it up and have garrisons, small legions of soldiers, usually around 5,000 or 10,000 soldiers, one in each province, dotted all over the empire. Basically as a combined local defense force in case of invasion, but also a police force to stop riots and enforce law and all these kinds of things. And if an uprising broke out really anywhere in the Roman Empire, they could get messages very quickly to a bunch of different garrisons in the area, and they would all converge on that one place. So an uprising, say in Egypt, might start against the 10,000 Roman soldiers there, but very quickly the Roman government could get another 40 or 50,000 soldiers into Egypt to fight back. Does that make sense? So that's one reason that the roads were so heavily invested in, because they have to move soldiers around on almost a constant basis. There's many, many attempts at uprising and complaint against the Roman state for the next few hundred years. Does that make sense? And the Romans get also really good, especially at building aqueducts. The major ones would be located in Italy, because Rome is a gigantic, booming city of maybe 500,000 people. I mean, it's just absolutely enormous for the ancient world. And the Roman government decides that the city of Rome itself has to be so great and so superior to everything else in the world that one way to do that is just to keep their people clean. So they want to bring a lot of fresh water into Rome on a nearly constant basis. So they build giant aqueducts to bring water out of the mountains of their area and bring it into Rome, almost like man-made river systems. And the aqueduct systems that they build are just absolutely enormous for anything comparatively in the ancient world, because whenever you have a movement of water, what happens when you run into a mountain that you need to get around to get to Rome? You need to move the water. Well, you can't. It's tough to build over it because they don't have the pumps to pull the water like we have today.
They have like a thing so when the water goes down the hill, it pressurizes and shoots.
Yeah, but they'd also blast right through the mountain or dig tunnels through it or something. They'd engineer it and figure it out. Or when they got to a kind of high point of land and a drop in the valley and then another high point in the land, what would they do?
Bridge.
Yeah, they had to build bridges to keep the water moving at a perfect kind of downward slope the whole way, sometimes for 30 or 40 miles. So they're, some of the most brilliant engineering schemes of the ancient world is just to move this amount of water around. So you can see the engineering feat that they created to build some of this stuff is pretty impressive, especially for the ancient world, and obviously still using arches and whatnot in buildings and design today. And they built these things not just for Rome, but they built aqueducts for many of their larger cities all over the empire. And this is hugely costly. So the Romans also had to figure out how to maximize their tax revenue on a yearly basis. And the way that Augustus and his advisors figured out was to standardize the tax collection. Basically, many ancient governments hired private people or private companies to go out and, say, collect the tax revenue from certain cities or villages or wherever. That has an obvious problem with it. And what do you think this problem could be? Yeah, they steal from what they're collecting. So not only are they getting a government paycheck to go out and do the work, but they're taking money from the people before that money has to be accounted for and shows up in the kind of state fund, the state repository. So what Augustus did, and his government did, was basically make all those tax collectors into government employees, into government bureaucrats. So this increases the size of the bureaucracy because suddenly now the government has all these jobs to fill. But it actually also at the same time increases the tax revenue because you eliminate most of the corruption involved in collecting the tax in the first place. You eliminate the stealing, the embezzling. So you have more government employees to pay, so government spending goes up, but revenue shoots up way beyond the amount that spending went up. So it's a gigantic kind of great investment that the Roman state gets involved with. So they have a larger tax base, or the amount of people that they're collecting the tax from remains the same, but the amount of money coming in is dramatically increased because you got rid of all that theft by making them into government employees. And number two, when you collect the same amount of taxes year in and year out, you basically create a predictable government revenue. So the Roman state could estimate how much money it was going to make 2 years, 3 years, 5 years from now, and do building projects according to what their anticipated revenue was going to be. So they have long-term financial planning for the government, basically. That's largely how they pay for all these roads and aqueducts and barracks and theaters and amphitheaters and all these different government buildings that they're building all over the empire virtually at the same time. So the Roman government is extremely prosperous, has a lot of money to spend for a long, long time, doesn't even go into debt for a long time, for a couple generations. So the government runs what we call surplus. Government is bringing more money in revenue every year than it spends. Does that make sense? So they have this big treasury where they put all the extra money. At least that lasts for a while. So does that make sense? So even though they have more government employees and a bigger bureaucracy, it actually worked better than basically outsourcing the job to private companies, because the private companies would steal in huge amounts if they figured they could get away with it. Questions about that at all? Nope. So it's a big investment, but it pays for itself, and even more. We've seen this big chart before. This is just a kind of rehash of what we talked about last time with how a lot of politicians started using armies as a means to launch their political careers. So this starts with Marius, and then Sulla used it, and eventually Pompey and Caesar, and the guys who start future civil wars, they keep using it. So this was a big problem. It's probably one of the biggest problems of the Roman state when Augustus kind of takes the thing over and starts running it. He wants to figure out how to stop these cyclical civil wars and how to stop the use of politicians using the army to try to launch themselves in power. And Augustus and his advisors figured out some fairly easy methods of doing it. Number one, he and his advisors realized that in order to stop the civil wars, you have to kind of undercut all the reasons that the civil wars happen. And those are big armies, politicians that view war as useful for their own careers, and war as basically a business investment. So Augustus's big decision was basically shrink the size of the army and split it up and send it all over the place. So when the civil wars ended and he's in control, once he beats Mark Antony and Cleopatra, in 34, 31 BC, somewhere around there, there were estimated over 600,000 soldiers in all the armies combined, all the Roman armies. And that scared Augustus. So once Egypt was conquered, Augustus kind of took a lot of Egyptian land and parceled it out and gave it out to a lot of the soldiers in the army, about half of them and their officers, in order to pay them off and convince them to retire. It's basically a one-time payment if they want to leave the army. And a lot of them took it. And he shrinks the army by half with this one gigantic swoop. So he uses a lot of Egyptian wealth, and especially land, to basically buy out half the soldiers. Give them an immediate kind of pension, basically. And a lot of them take it. So he almost immediately, almost overnight, he cuts the army size in half. And then the remaining 300,000 or so soldiers, he splits them up into, I think it's 10,000 troops each, into these different legions, and sends them all over the empire to be basically the guards of all the provinces. So there's 28 provinces, there's 300,000 soldiers, so that's about 10,000 soldiers for each province. So he basically split the army up and did not kind of brought back those laws that said the armies are not allowed to enter the city of Rome itself. But he didn't even want them in Italy, the whole peninsula. He wants to keep them completely away from the governing center entirely. So he sends them out to the provinces. And once they're broken up into all their different 28 barracks, basically, each 10,000 soldiers in one place, each of them gets their kind of general of that particular legion. Does that make sense? And another thing he realized is to rotate the generals, move them around. Don't put one general with his troops in Egypt and let him just stay there year after year after year, because he's going to somehow figure out a way to get the absolute ironclad loyalty of his troops, where that army will be more loyal to him than to anybody else, including the general Roman government. Does that make sense? So the idea was, rotate the generals every 6 months or so. Don't let them stay in one place for very long, because they'll try to get the loyalty of their troops. They'll make political contacts with the rich people of the area to get the big money on their side, and that could start a revolution. Does that make sense? So constantly rotating these generals from one province, one barracks to another, in order to stop those ties from getting developed. The problem at that point, though, is that there's no army in Italy to actually guard Rome, the governing center. So Augustus created this other group that comes to be known as the Praetorian Guard, which at first is like a national guard for Italy. Has something like 5,000 troops in it, but it's only supposed to be in Italy to guard against, in case of an absolutely catastrophic war where the general armies are out there losing and you have to mobilize this Italian fighting force, or as a kind of riot police in Italy in case riots break out, which there's a lot of poor people in Rome and other cities also, so poor, hungry people are often desperate enough to start riots. Eventually, especially after Augustus's lifetime, the Praetorian Guard kind of evolves to be more the king's personal bodyguard in the palaces and in the city of Rome itself, but they follow him everywhere. So eventually they get like these special uniforms with purple coloring, because purple becomes the color of the emperor over the years. And in case of a gigantic catastrophe, if somehow there's a war that you need a lot more soldiers to fight off some kind of invasion in Italy, Augustus's government also created what became known as the auxiliary force, which is basically a lot of former retired soldiers in the normal Roman armies all over the provinces that have moved back to Italy, and they sign up to be kind of on-call soldiers. So they have weapons in their homes and whatnot. If you're living in Italy and you've never even been a Roman soldier, you could also sign up to be one of these guys like shock troops in case of like a national emergency. And a lot of people who didn't have Roman citizenship signed up for this because, much like the U.S. military today, if you just sign up and you're not an official citizen, you can become a citizen after a couple years of service. Does that make sense? So this attracts a lot of people that aren't formal citizens, so they can't start their own businesses and try to launch themselves on the path to wealth. This is an open door for them. So you get a lot of people taking advantage of that opportunity. And the auxiliaries, they last decades and decades and decades. So it's this open chance for a lot of people to kind of try to move up the social economic ladder. Does that make sense? So this is what's happening in Italy itself, since all the major armies are all out in the provinces. So questions about any of this? Nope. So figuring out how to stop the army from being a revolutionary force is another kind of pillar of stability, at least in Augustus' lifetime and a couple generations after him. Another big one is the use of entertainment to kind of distract or appeal to the masses of the Roman citizens and everyone else living in Rome and the other big cities. Rome built big racetracks, basically, held chariot races and all kinds of things. They had big circuses. They had theaters where instead of like we have movies today, they would go and watch plays. So they had sometimes extremely realistic like fight scenes in their plays and comedies and all kinds of things going on. The biggest and most famous things that you've probably heard of are the gladiator fights in the big Colosseums. It appears that the Romans, when they invaded Greece, they kind of took a lot of Greek culture and made it kind of Romanish. So a lot of the like Roman statues often have like a Greek look to them after a while, to the point where today art historians call it the Greco-Roman era, because the Romans just kind of take over all Greek art and just try to make it their own, basically, and claim that they did it in the first place, which is tough. But another thing that they kind of took over from the Greeks was a kind of love of physical combat in public. You know, how we talk with Greece about the polis and how men would get together and have like boxing matches and races and all kinds of things to demonstrate that some guys are like better, stronger, or smarter, or whatever than others. So the Romans kind of took that into their culture after they invaded and conquered Greece, and took on this idea of having like boxing matches or fighting events, and they would do it in these big public arenas. The most famous is visually known as the Colosseum, about 100 years after Augustus dies. This giant Colosseum in Rome is built and is emulated. There's smaller Colosseums built all over the Roman cities, all over the empire. These gladiator matches were not always to the death. In fact, in Augustus' lifetime, they were rarely to the death. It's mostly kind of like a UFC fight until one person either gets knocked unconscious or they just surrender. But Augustus, every once in a while, would announce like a special weekend of fights to the death. And obviously those would get much bigger crowds because the Romans are very violent people. So, you know, you imagine what happened to like the TV ratings for a UFC fight where it's announced, you know, one of these people is actually going to die in this ring tonight, and it just go through the roof, right? No?
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely would. One of my former professors used to say that he just wants the right to sell the T-shirts outside the stadium when something like that's going on, because there are going to be so many people there. But, you know, people often at their most base are very violent and enjoy seeing violence, especially if it's not happening to someone that they care about. So the Romans, especially after Augustus dies, in the years after Zero, the fights become like increasingly violent and eventually even increasingly weird. It seems that after a while the Romans got kind of bored with just fights until someone taps out. They wanted to see more fights to the death. And even with fights to the death, they even, after a few decades, start getting kind of bored with that. So they try to come up with inventive, what they called contests, almost like experiments, to see what kind of fighting is best. So they would take two fighters trained in two different styles and have them fight to the death, and just to see which fighting style is better. Or they equip two different fighters with two different weapon systems. Like one guy would get a small shield and a sword, and another guy would get like a spear and a net, and they would go at each other. They would capture wild animals from faraway places that a lot of people living in Rome had never seen before, and would throw those against fighters to see what kind of fighting systems are good for fighting in what kind of environments. Eventually they'd take two different kinds of animals that they'd never seen before and throw them against each other and see which animal is stronger or better or faster. Or take a really strong animal against a really fast animal and send them to fight to the death and see what happens. So they're almost like sick experiments that they call contests. They eventually even re-engineer the giant Colosseum, where the Colosseum had a sand floor, because sand absorbs blood much better than marble or stone or anything else. It indicates to you how violent these things could be. I mean, people are sometimes getting ripped apart by bears or lions or something, so it could be pretty horrific depending on your view of these things. But with the dirt floor, they even figured out eventually how to flood the whole thing and bring boats in so they could have naval battles. So they could test out naval warfare. And sometimes they would dress one group of fighters up as like some foreign enemy that they won, that Caesar won a great battle against however many years ago, as like a reenactment of a battle to celebrate to commemorate the anniversary of the battle. So it gets kind of strange after a while. A lot of the fighters are professionally trained. Sometimes they train their whole lives. People could volunteer to go into training to be one of the gladiators because they were the most famous athletes of their time. So, you could get famous off of this stuff, and you could sell your image and get rich if you survived the fighting. You could also make a lot of money off of gambling in this stuff. Gambling amongst the audience watching these fights was a big, big industry. So a fighter that was an underdog in the event could bet on himself, and if he won, he could be extremely rich suddenly. Does that make sense? And before the massive fighting to the death and the more kind of fighting until someone taps out, there were accusations that some of the fighters were taking bribes and throwing the fight because gamblers offered them a lot of money to take a dive, basically. Not so easy when you're fighting to the death, obviously. The Roman senators and politicians, and all the way up to Augustus himself and his own family, often attended these events because this is really popular stuff amongst the Roman voters. And politicians, just like politicians today, they avoid saying or doing anything that could be seen as offensive to the voters, right? So they'll show up to these events even if they don't really like them, and they'll cheer in the events because they know the people like it. And these events continue to grow and grow and grow in kind of size and scale and just the insanity of it. When one guy became emperor, he announced something like 100 days of gladiator fights to the death just to celebrate that he got to the throne. So that's 3 solid months of this stuff, day after day after day. This is a computer rendering of what the Colosseum would have looked like. We know that they had traps in the ground, so they engineered like surprise attacks, where suddenly the ground would open up and like a tiger or something would pop up on a raised level to start contributing to the fighting, just to make it more exciting. And we also know that Italy can get pretty warm in the summertime, so they engineered a giant canvas overhang that could be pulled by workers standing outside the stadium to cover the whole stadium to keep the sun off the audience. Special seats, especially with the emperor and the royal family and important politicians, don't see it in this one, but they had like a special little row of like VIP seating that had heated or cooled seats depending on the weather. So they go through massive amount of engineering to figure out how to make these projects bigger and better, and the entertainment's like more exciting, more unpredictable. And of course that takes more government investment. These are government buildings. So when the fights are going on, you don't even have to buy a ticket. It's just open doors. Except for the VIP places, but the rest of it is just kind of general seating. So just from the fact that you're a Roman citizen, you get to go in and watch this stuff. So it's seen as a gift of the Roman state to its people to provide entertainment. And the politicians, most of them would never risk their political career in criticizing anything like this. You very rarely get politicians saying this is inhumane, this is horrible, or this is just a waste of money, because they know that people love it. Does that make sense? And it's still true today. Most of the stadiums that are built around the United States today, the football stadium being built in Los Angeles right now or very soon or something, that is the only one I can recall in really the past 25 years that's been built with the owner's money, the guy who owns the team. All the other ones are built with public money, so they raise your taxes and take out loans in your name to pay for all these different stadiums. So it's public expense. And do politicians usually criticize that in the United States? No, because they know that sports fans are voters. So a lot of politicians sign off on these ridiculous building projects that they know their city or state's never going to get that money back. It's just a waste. It's just a giveaway to team owners. But they don't dare say anything against it because their voters love that sport and they love that team. They'll vote you out of office if you speak out against it. Does that make sense? I mean, some of these are in the billions of dollars. Massive amounts of money. So politics in the ancient world in some ways is very similar to what we have going on right now. Don't offend the people if they have an ability to kick you out of office. So questions about that at all? No? Good. All right. The last two are pretty self-explanatory. The Roman economy is large. It is multinational. It has access to all these different kinds of resources, from North Africa to the very kind of edge of the Middle East, up into Anatolia, ancient Greece, and dominating all the parts of Europe that the Romans thought had any value at all. So they have all these different resources. They have really everything they need to build their economy. They don't rely on anything from the outside world, really. Some Romans get interested in trading with the outside world eventually. But the stuff they import are basically luxury goods. Just rare, cool stuff, not really useful, not necessary. Does that make sense? So just the areas that the Roman Empire covers already, they have enough kind of diversity in their economy to keep their economy growing and self-sufficient for at least a few more decades. And the Romans, generally, their foreign policy is pretty easy because they've conquered all the large kingdoms that could possibly threaten their empire. The last one was really Egypt. There's really no one out there on the periphery that seems capable of threatening the Roman state. There's German tribes living kind of north up into where Germany is today, up here in northern Central Europe. There's Germans out there, or what we today call Germans, running around. But they're usually not unified. These German tribes usually fight against each other over land and dominance and all these other kinds of things. So the Romans find it pretty easy to make deals with different tribes and keep the Germans in their own basically ongoing civil wars. The Celts in kind of far northern, the British Islands, across the Roman border, the Romans control the southern half of the British island, what is today England and Wales. So the Celts say further north of that in what is today Scotland. And they're, again, divided amongst themselves, and they have too small of a population to probably threaten the Roman Empire much at all. And the only other one out there is further east of here, the Persian Empire, but they're at this point kind of fallen, and they're having all kinds of internal problems. So they're kind of way out there, not really an immediate threat at all to the Roman Empire. So there's no likelihood of a foreign invasion for a long time. So the wars that happen with Rome for the next few hundred years are really civil wars. And we'll talk next time about how some politicians lose control or figure out how to overthrow the system, and that'll start new rounds of civil wars about 50 years after Augustus is gone. Does that make sense? All right, so Rome's problems are going to be problems of its own, kind of internal corruption over the next few hundred years. And that'll kind of hollow out the Roman state, where all these different things that we've talked about today, each of the strengths of the Roman Empire really is corrupted and destroyed from the inside, and eventually the Roman state will basically collapse. So we'll talk about that collapse in detail next time.